Thank you. Well, thanks everyone for coming. I'm a little embarrassed that there's a picture of me on the screen, but my wife put together a nice PowerPoint that she was going to come in and do, my wife Sonia, and I sort of stepped in at the last minute. So I'm going to hijack things a little bit because I've got a captive audience, and to get a fisherman to talk about fishing isn't generally very hard. So I thought I will just go through what we've got here. And so I'm going to try to keep it brief, talk about 15 minutes about the history of fishing and in particular gill netting for salmon in BC and how we got to where we are now and what it's like for a fisherman. I know this may be what some of you study and others it might be quite new, but the sort of the state of the fleet and what it's like to be a fisherman and how we got there. Then what is Skipper Otto's? I can't not tell you about our community-supported fishery. One, because I'm proud of it, and two, my wife would kill me if I don't at least try to sell you some, ethical fish and help disrupt the seafood supply chain. And then hopefully some time for some questions, if I can leave enough time. And then I think there's pizza somewhere, I was told. Okay, good. There's some ellipsis there. So there's a boat. So I'd like to talk about gill netting a little bit. And in particular, gill netters. They are the most numerous of fishermen in the BC industry. They were the start of the commercial fishing industry in British Columbia. They're also, for the most part, unusual people that are rather insane. I hang around with a lot of them. I often marvel at guys that I can't imagine being actually functioning in any other job, holding a job, existing in mainstream society, and yet they can be really successful in running these boats and getting things done, and rebuilding engines in the middle of the night and swells and things. So I'd like to talk about them now. Who are they? Your average fisherman now, commercial gill netter, far fewer than they used to be. Boat owners. Over the 20th century, they were boat owners, renters, various relationships with the department. I'd just like to share a few, pretty interesting, talk about the sort of the class position of a gill netter, or where they fit into the means of production, to use Marxist terms. They've been variously described, in some cases by UBC sociologists, as entrepreneurs, working class fishers, co-adventurers, simple or dependent commodity producers, as well as, I like this one, an ambiguous group, neither fully labor nor fully capital. So, okay, who are these people and what do they do? In the 1870s, canning for salmon started in the Fraser River in a large way. Dozens of canneries started, and it was always an export market. Clearly, there wasn't much of a population here. It was designed to go overseas, and the first boats that fished them were gill netters, which were sail-powered, rowing, drift nets. It's only ever been drift nets in BC. There's never been anchored nets. It's not my area of expertise. I'm not an anthropologist, but I believe the First Nations weren't using set nets either. And they were some of the first employed to run the 70s in the Fraser, as well as Chinese labor, right from the very beginning, working in the canneries. So these kind of boats are extremely limited. Here's you initially, if you're out in the Gulf, as we call it, or the Strait of Georgia, or in the river, you would get towed out. You really can't row these things in or out. So you would usually have a steam tug, by the company steam tug, that would have a long line, imagine a rope tow, with two people on each boat holding onto this tow, possibly looping it around a cleat, and getting towed out and letting go when you got to your spot. Then you go out there, and it's sometimes fishing for up to 6 days without coming in. Sails could be lowered, booms laid down, make a little tent, that's where you sleep. At one point, what's the 9 o'clock gun used to fire and call the end of fishing. It was a hard way to make a living. Some people, there were times when you didn't do it all day, but there were certain times of the year where you fished constantly. So from the beginning, it's a history of monopolizing an industry, and this is what sort of fishermen have faced from the very beginning. The canneries somehow lobbied to have licenses to fish for salmon in British Columbia tied exclusively to the salmon canneries. You could not go and do it unless you had a license from a salmon cannery. That started to change by the 1809, I believe. People lobbied for some more access. But you were still tied to a cannery because there was nowhere else to sell your fish. As well, we were technologically tied in. The nets you used, linen, hand knotted, they would rot and fall apart very quickly if you didn't dip them in copper sulfate, which has its own problems, but that kept them from rotting. Massive copper sulfate tanks are not something people owned on their own. You needed a salmon cannery or fish company to do that. You needed net sheds. Also, there was no access to a market. Small, but what would you do? So the way they would stay out at sea is you would have the same tugs that towed them out would come and collect your fish every 12 hours or so, every morning, every night. Come get your fish and you would stay out. The canneries liked this very much because they controlled it and put fishermen in a very dependent situation. From the very beginning, there were attempts at labor organization. At one point, there were something like 17 different fishing unions on the coast, but they were split racially, they were split linguistically. There was one I tried to research, but the entire constitution of the union is written in Finnish. So there's a big divide. When they did manage to organize, you found out what side government was on very quickly. In 1901, there was a big industry-wide strike on the Fraser River, and they called in the army. So the Royal BC Regiment has a great history in the Boer War, if you call that great, First World War, Dieppe, and they were known briefly as the Sockeye Fusiliers in 1901 because they broke the strike. So I find it was stacked pretty heavily against fishermen. They were wage workers, and finally by 1899 they were all actually, or 1889, they were all paid simply for the fish they delivered. Could you build your own boat? Absolutely. It cost, from when I look up, about $75 to $100, $150 to build a boat. But nobody would lend you the money for that because they were not really useful for anything else, so you could borrow the money from a fish company. There was some competition amongst the companies until about 1902 when BC Packers was formed, British Columbia Packers. They rolled in, now I have to look at the numbers because it's going to sound like I'm exaggerating. Packers, I think it was like 25 to 35 different canneries were taken over, hostile. There was strong arming. It was bloody business. In fact, Diane Newell here from the university here collected the papers of Henry Doyle, who was key in that. And it's, his memoir is called A Grown Man's Game. Right? It was rough arms. So they started monopolizing very quickly, and they managed to lobby for all kinds of different regulations. Now, the canning side of it is fascinating too, but as far as fishermen, engines that were suitable for powering a gillnetter, small boat, became available about 1906. So immediately, the canneries lobbied for the prohibition of motorized boats anywhere north of Georgia Strait. That had to still be sail-powered. They controlled it. They towed their fleets up. They used different, there's strategies for arguing this. We're protecting the First Nations so that power boats don't come in, all kinds of other things. But they maintained a tight grip on it. Around World War I, the industry absolutely took off. World War I and II, British Columbia canned salmon was a main ration of the British Armed Forces and the colonial forces worldwide. It made the industry extremely lucrative and led to the companies investing in some motorized boats and allowing eventually motorized boats north of the Strait of Georgia. They needed to expand. This is what became. Now this is probably, I'm guessing, it's an undated photo, about probably in the 40s. What you've got is still a double-ended boat. So it's very tippy, can't hold very much, but you can pull the net easily. You pull the boat easily astern. That dates to when you were hand pulling the nets. Put the drums on. They started showing up in the 20s, but weren't universally adopted till just about post-war. Now, these obviously wind your net in. The engine's taking strain, but it's belt-driven. There's no hydraulics. They're still weak. You still need a powerful boat. It allows fishermen to be older. This made the knowledge of a fisherman more important than brute strength and let people have a much longer career at it. But this boat can still hold 1,000, 2,000 pounds of fish. It's got a gasoline engine that holds enough, and its tanks hold enough fuel for maybe a couple of days. You need a company fuel barge. You need basically everything you did before. But things got a little easier. Now this boat, still tied to the companies. Unionization, fishermen, as they were allowed to build these boats and could move up and down the coast more, you started having sort of a meeting of people, these disparate groups, racial, ethnic groups, groups from the Skeena, groups from the Fraser. They would meet on the mid-coast inlets. Rivers Inlet was a hotbed of this. Everyone would get together and start talking unionization. As well as the 30s, you started having the heavy influence of communist unions or union organizers who were really speaking post-racial. You know, we need to organize. This is about class. And it was catching on. It was really scaring the companies. So they did manage to have a few strikes, and amazingly, they were all beaten down. The United Fishermen and Allied Workers Union, which still kind of exists. It's not the original union. It's part of Unifor now. They never were actually a legal bargaining agent for these guys. A combines branch. This is one of the most fun, I mean horrible, but just almost funny arguments. They went on strike against the companies, who were now numbered 3. And the companies argued for a combines branch investigation because they said the thousands of gill netters making a few $100s, they were the producers, and the companies were the consumers. And therefore, any unionization by these guys is an illegal combination of producers ripping off the consumers. And so they were actually fined, and the union's offices were continually raided right up until the 70s. At the same time, the last of the remaining big companies, BC Packer is obviously a huge one, and Canadian Fish, which still exists today, were the big companies. The 2 rivals to them that still existed were J.H. Todd Company and Anglo-BC Packers, ABC. Oh, and Nelson Brothers. But unknown to everybody, BC Packers and Canadian Fish actually jointly, the 2 biggest competitors, jointly bought, which one did they buy? They bought J.H. Todd in about 1950 and didn't tell anybody. Their own vice presidents didn't know that they owned their 3rd biggest competitor between the 2 of them. That came out in another combines branch investigation. Actually, the federal government found that out and said, no, sell it. So that there really wasn't any competition. Further than that, BC Packers owned Nelson Brothers and didn't tell anyone and pretended that they were competing all the way up through the 60s. And then finally, ABC Fishery. So it was J.H. Todd and ABC. Finally, they said, actually, they jointly owned that one too. And so they split it, and Canadian Fish got the canneries in Prince Rupert, and BC Packers got the fleet. So there really never was any competition, but there's been a big. Okay, so there's. It's not a super picture of a modern gill netter. I just like it because I was fishing it that day, and the drone flew over and took a picture, and a humpback whale breached in behind us. It was all very nice. So here's a more modern one. A bunch of things happened, and this is what I find a really interesting period, and how we got to modern gill netting and the size of the fleet today. In 1969, the Davis Plan was enacted, and I don't know how many people are familiar with the Davis Plan. If you do fisheries policy, that was, let's limit the number of these boats. Too many boats, too hard to manage this fleet. How do we do it? If you have an existing salmon boat that's been productive for the last 10 years, you get an A license. With this A license, you can fish salmon, you can fish cod, you can troll tuna, but salmon was the valuable one. If your boat's been inactive, you got a B license. You've got 10 years to secure an A license, or you're out of the industry. Okay, all of a sudden that gave some value licenses. Of course, the system was gamed. The first thing that happened is they decided for the big seine, this went for seine boats and trollers as well. There's 3 ways to commercially catch salmon. These are, of course, the most numerous. What they did was for seine boats, they're steam registered. You know what the tonnage is. For gill netters, most of them aren't registered. They're licensed boats, so they did an estimate. A boat this long has this much tonnage, and they decided through lobbying from the fish companies that you could combine smaller ones to get the license for a big one. So it did a few things. One, well, let me look at the numbers here, because first thing BC Packers did with the old Nelson Brothers fleet, which they had got in the merger, was take about, by their own admission afterwards, about 200 derelict vessels. Some of them didn't even exist anymore up on dock. They found every record they could of all their derelict vessels and got licenses for them. Then they would take 3 33-foot or 2 33-foot gill netters, double-end gill netters like the one I showed you earlier, and make a seiner out of it. So what actually happened, I get the numbers, by 1969 to 1970, the gill net fleet dropped from 3,760 gill netters to 2,832. So, almost 1,000 gill netters less. And the seine fleet went up from 397 boats to 514. And seiners are not twofold, but 10 to 20-fold more productive than a gill netter. So you end up with 200 less, or almost 1,000 less unproductive boats, and get over 100 more of these guys. So the Davis plan, all it did actually was increase the capacity of the fleet and monopolize it. This boat's worth millions. You can't no individual owns these. They never did. Some First Nations bands owned the older wooden ones that predated it. These are corporate owned. By the late 90s, on record, Canadian Fishing Company, now solely owned by Jim Pattison, owned 39% of the seine fleet. That was in the 90s. It's higher than that now. So the gill netters disappeared more and more. But the ones that did stay, you have a license. Previously, if you wanted to build a boat, you needed financing. You financed it through a fish company. The only people that would finance you. You then owe them all your fish at whatever they want to pay you. Thus the need to unionize. When you have an A license, it's got value. A salmon gill netter is not worth much. It's too small. It can't do anything but fish for salmon. You got an A license, all of a sudden the Royal Bank started taking out ads in all of the fish trade journals. Fisheries improvement loans, independent fisherman's plan. We'll lend you money. Your license is collateral. At the same time, smaller diesel engines became really available. Cats and Volvos, people started putting them in. You had a bigger range now. Your boats were safer. Boats were starting to be made of fiberglass. If you've got now a license that's worth $100,000 that was previously worth nothing, all of a sudden, you're not going to put it on a piece of junk boat. So the capitalization of even the reduced gill net fleet went way up. That boat I showed you earlier held about 2,000 pounds. I could put 18,000 on this one. I never did. I was always hoping to. But, so you really heavily capitalized everything. So the guys that were still in it had bigger boats, more expensive, and they owed more money. But that worked because in 1977, Canada followed the rest of the world and said 200-mile international boundary, started patrolling it. Familiar with previously, 12 miles they would patrol? There was a very large fleet of actually Japanese, mostly fishermen, within the 200-mile border of Canada and other places, down the US as well. And from 1978 on, they couldn't do that. How much did they take? It was all estimates before, but I can tell you that in 1978, cash buyers started showing up. So you had fishermen who borrowed from a bank, not the company, which meant they could sell to an independent And there had been buyers before, but very limited. So now you're free to sell to whoever you want, somewhat. You got long range. You don't need to go to a little fish camp anymore. And you've got boats showing up with great big signs, 10-foot signs in the mast, in red letters, cash. They would come in with $1 million cash, and you would just go to them, and they would buy your fish $1 a pound more than others. This blew up in 1978. There was a strike by the United Fishermen and Allied Workers Union against the big companies. They wanted 25 cents a pound more or something, and more wages for shore workers and everything else. What bothered the independents was one couldn't afford a strike. They were heavily capitalized. They weren't selling to the companies anyway, and cash buyers were paying $1 a pound more than they actually were even negotiating for. So they found it irrelevant. But it's still, you ended up with basically two classes of fishermen: the guys who still owned boats owned by or fish company boats, and you had people that were on their own independent. So that got pretty ugly at the time. But the union fishermen, it started to go down really quickly. The B licenses were gone, and you ended up with more and more people like this. And at one point, by the late 80s, the cash price, well, we've only actually caught up to it now. This is going to sound ridiculous, but I was fishing at Smith Inlet with my father as a teenager, and a float plane landed. Great big float plane started going up the inlet, and word just spread really quietly. We don't know who they are, but they're paying $5.50 a pound for salmon. Just go and deliver it, and then they fly away. Was this recorded anywhere? No. But a float plane actually landed and made its way up. So there was big money flying it over out of seas. So you end up, now we've got a capitalized fleet. You need to fish hard. This boat, it's old now, but like I said, licenses were up to $100,000. By 1978, a boat would cost you, well, probably $100,000 for a boat and license, $150,000 for a brand new one. My father bought his gill netter in 1969 for $3,000 with an A license. He sold that license in the 90s for $120,000. Thought he was going to cash out, couldn't handle it, bought another boat 6 months later. He actually sold his boat probably for good last summer. He's 77. So you also came in with, and a bow picker was used. Instead of a cabin on the back, a cabin in the front and the net in the back, you've got the drum in the front. They were used in Columbia River. They were used in various places for a long time, but all of a sudden they started being built here for different reasons. You can make them really fast. Now you're looking at a $200,000 boat that can fly up and down the coast. This boat, 7-8 knots. Bow pickers, 25. Just go. This got a little bit alarming to the Department of Fisheries because all of a sudden all the boats showed up for an opening. Oh, the skein is open. Let's go. Everybody's there. Everybody's back. So you got mid-90s, you got the Davis plan. Sorry, the Mifflin plan. You guys, some of you would know this one more. This was area licensing. Now you've got your fast boat, and you've got your license, which was worth $100,000 to fish everywhere on the coast, and it came in really fast in 1996. Okay, the coast is divided in 3 now for gill netters. Pick your spot. North, West Coast, Central, or Fraser River and South. That's where your license is good for now. You want to fish both places. If your traditional fishing area was south and north, buy another license. So licenses bound up. So you ended up again with a monopolization. Well, not a monopolization, but a shrinking of the fleet and an increased capitalization. You either had a license to fish one area and just tied up your boat if it didn't open there, or you bought more and more licenses and stacked them. So now we've got a situation where when prices started to drop, when fish farming started really taking a lot of the market, which it did for a while. Now the demand for salmon is up so that there's demand for everything we catch. But for a while there, aquaculture started flooding the market and it just dropped the price of fish. You have people really struggling. And so you've got the situation now where your bow picker, which was designed to fish the whole coast, is completely useless if it's just licensed for the Fraser River. You might as well be on an old slow boat and save your money. So it did cause a bit of a crisis. Where we're at in terms of numbers, well, there's less than 1,000 actually active gill netters now. The high number was, at one point, Royal Commission of 1906, just over 6,000 gill netters. So it was the backbone of the industry. It certainly isn't anymore. And by the way, BC Packers, which was the huge one, was bought in a merger by Canadian Fish years ago. There's one. There are some small ones now. You can actually operate. There's more independence now because the fresh market is so much bigger, because world shipping, world trade, and the local market is bigger. But as far as companies, I mean, if you know the way the BC Packers bought by Canadian Fish, that's entirely owned by Jim Pattison now, and they bought Ocean Fish about 5 years ago and shut it down. It's just a label. And a bunch of others are controlled as well. I don't even really keep up anymore. But so that's the nature of fishing, but you can still sell for cash if you've got licenses for everywhere. Okay, so change hats. What do we do? Looking at Sonia's notes here. Okay, what do? What we do? Fishing can be a fishy business. Okay, I don't write punny stuff, but I will go along with it. There's nothing necessarily inherently wrong with open midwater trawling, but it's great because it looks alarming to people that don't fish. That's a lot of fish. But fishing is a bit of a nasty business. I told you about the monopolization of the industry. I didn't even get into how they've crushed fishermen over the years. It's not just fishermen that get ripped off. I mean, the shore workers had their own fights, and consumers. So now let's talk about what's going on now. Okay, this is one of Sonia's slides. I know there are problems with the study. I know they cooked the data somewhat, and they all do a little bit, but really, you can't actually fake it entirely. This was, Oceana's this year when they sampled retailers in Toronto. You find the same things in Boston. You find in Vancouver when they sampled DNA sampled sushi this year. It was, 40% of it was kind of related to what it was. And when you start calling things grouper, well, even if it is grouper, what does that mean? But people aren't getting what they pay for, and which means you can't really make an informed environmental choice either if you don't know what it is you're actually buying. So even more concerning to me, obviously I'm sort of interested in the labor side of it, is this one. This was just a couple of weeks ago. This came out November 7th. But I mean, we've known about this for a long time, that the world seafood chain is pretty horrible. And not always like outright slavery, call it heavily indentured. I mean, it's very common for workers on Thai shrimp boats to have their passports sort of taken, and like you'll see this in 8 months. So you're kind of stuck. There was a case a couple of years ago. I'm not sure how many people heard about it, but they were looking at the labor practices of people working on fish boats out of Hawaii. And the big pier out of Oahu, there's a number of deckhands on American boats that weren't allowed ashore because they didn't have passports. They had to live on that pier. So there's problems. The deeper you look, the more problems you find. So how do you address that as a consumer, let alone as a fisherman? The other concern for me, and this is, I know, irony because I do work part-time at the port in shipping, but in terms of food miles and food security, we have estimates on the amount of fish that's actually processed overseas and shipped back, but we're not entirely sure. What have we got? In some cases, it's conservative. 70 to 90% of our seafood in Canada is imported from foreign fisheries, which seems bizarre considering we export 75 to 80% of it. Historically, that made sense. There weren't enough people here to eat it. We were fishing for the British Army. We were fishing for Ireland was, for some reason, a great consumer of red salmon. They have their own fisheries, but that's always been the way it is. But now there are millions of us that live here. It isn't a reason to export it all when we don't have to, especially when you get into quota ownerships in other fisheries. I'm happy to take questions on it, but I'm probably not the expert in the room on it anyway. So what we did is start a community-supported fishery as a way to sort of address many of these things in a small way. We call it Skipper Otto's because, well, that's Otto in the corner. That's my father fishing, probably about 70 years old in that picture, to sell his catch and to sort of make connections with consumers here that care. That's Pilar landing a tuna. We thought we invented community-supported fisheries. My wife and I bought vegetables and things through community-supported agriculture, CSAs. We weren't inventing anything new. We just sort of scratched our heads and think, could we do this with fish? Because in 2008 or so, fishermen were still getting paid very little for salmon. It would go up when there was a scarcity, and then even in 2010, when the Fraser came roaring back after the 2009 was so bad they had the Royal Commission. 2010, all of a sudden you start catching fish again. Okay, we're going to pay back the debts, we're going to make everything, and the fish price of salmon dropped to $1 something a pound. Just, oh, we got some, we don't need you now. So can we sell the fish ethically? Are there enough consumers that care about it? We sort of said, well, let's call it a CSF. And, quick Google, anybody doing this? No, nobody. Turns out 3 other people worldwide at exactly the same time. So, and we know them well. They're so it's a subscription service, and we do it our own ways. People in this room work for us. Anybody that needs a bit of a part-time job, do talk to me. We're always looking for people. And it worked amazingly well. We started with 48 people who I like to repeat this, but a journalist actually asked me early on, like when pushing the idea, it's like, okay, I give you $250, you promise to go fishing. I'm like, yup. Like, huh. But 40 people went for it, 48, and now 2,400 members across Canada. So this is how we like to promote it. That's your traditional supply chain. Running through an auction, sometimes export, bring it back, sometimes not. Can go all the way up. This is our supply chain, and in some cases, I'm that guy too. So, for the consumer side, and you want to know that we're telling the truth, you want to know that people are actually paid a living wage for the fish. You want to know exactly where it came from. Some people have concerns labor-wise. Some people are concerned environmentally. Both very valid. Is it what we say it is? Is it being caught the way we say it is? We do fingerprint traceability. These are all the people that fish for us. And most of them are extremely happy and proud to have their pictures on fish and actually be recognized for it. Fernando here was walking by our locker where we're packing fish about a year ago, and I think it was Chris, one of our employees, saw him walking by. I'd never met him before, but saw the label. He'd seen the label, and we're like, "Hey, wait a minute! Hey, Fernando!" He's like, "Know you?" Like, "Yeah, here, it's a can of salmon with your name on it, smoked salmon. Here, take one." I got a phone call like 2 days later. Fernando was back home in Seashelt or Gibson's. He lives Sunshine Coast. He's like, "Okay, I'm going back to Portugal. My wife says I need 2 cases. Now I have to put them aside. And people here have probably done that. We got to put some more aside for Fernando before they all sell out because he needs to take these home to show everybody what he does with his fish. And most people get a real kick out of it. So why do we think we're good at it? I mean, there's other CSFs have struggled. I think it's because we weren't started by an NGO. We weren't started by well-meaning people, which is fantastic, but we were actually started by a fishing family. And the first fish that we sold were my father's, and when it got too busy, I'd go with them. And I got back into fishing more and more myself. And then we simply grew to his friends. And as we grew more, I mean, our tuna actually started because we were having a pickup, and there were about 40 people lined up for salmon because we didn't have staff, and we were distributing them one by one. And a fisherman named Gray came by and said, do you think your people would like tuna? Well, ask them. Tuna price had dropped from $4 a pound to like $1.60. Like, can somebody buy this right now? And we got a resounding hell yes, and we started selling tuna. So fishermen, now our tuna fishermen are actually coming to us How much are we affecting the industry? Well, I know in at least one case they found out that our fishermen were getting paid a certain amount in Barkley Sound, and everyone else was getting paid this. And even though we couldn't buy for more people, there was enough screaming that the price of fish for everybody went up about 5 cents a pound. It's not making us a lot of friends, but so far we haven't been stepped on by anybody big. So I wouldn't have put these pictures in again because I wasn't going to give this talk, but there's Sonia put in a picture of my father, probably about my age now, and me in 78. So right about when I talked about the big changeover, fishing on our little 30-foot gill netter with an A license, and it was worth something. So I started going at about 7. There's me and Lyndon, about 4. My youngest, Sonny, our oldest. So a lot of you know what we've done. We have explained it somewhat. Here's where we're going. The bottleneck is still processing. The big companies, actually, a lot of it, there's huge contract processors that are happy to deal with you if you've got 100,000 pounds, but laugh at 1,000. And by the way, the salmon canning is done in BC. It's all offshored. The last salmon cannery, unionized cannery, was in Prince Rupert. It was shut down 2 years ago. It was Canadian fish. They offshored it. They have it done in Alaska or overseas. This is actually here in Richmond. That's Rumi. Her father was a fish cutter. She's a fish cutter, grew up in Richmond, but went back and actually trained at the Tokyo Fish Market. She's actually amazingly good at it. That's her family. They're sort of retired now, but this is hand cutting. Oh, okay. But there's no place for them to go. They lost their building. It's very tough. Our next expansion is this. So our community processing facility, I'm happy to say we actually just made an agreement with the Musqueam Capital Corp. They're building this building for us on federal land in Steveston. And we're going to have to outfit it, but what we can do then is custom processing, process our own, process for other independent fishermen that want to access a local market. Allows direct sales. We want to have it a very open place. Public tours and a training facility for next generation of fish cutters, because that is actually a skilled trade that is in demand as well, and we have people that are interested in it. I'm told I have really 10 minutes, so why don't we just take questions? Yeah, well, as I said, we started with 4 in North America. We were the first on the West Coast anywhere. There's about 50 now that we know of, and in some places it's really caught on. It's caught on to the point that we've had a few fake ones now on the East Coast using the name. I mean, the Fish Local Collaborative and a few others that have sort of become umbrella groups that we've basically started, and now the North American Marine Alliance, now it's North American Marine Alliance, because we've gone continental, it was North Atlantic. We've got a big campaign to actually have to take out a big ad in the New York Times going, these guys delivering fish in Manhattan are just a big fish company's delivery, despite the fact that it's CSF. But you sort of arrive when
they fake you.
It's got enough, yeah, it's got enough, you know, I guess, don't know the word, but we've got enough public awareness that people want to pretend to be us. But yes, they're sprouting up in many places, some more successful than others, some much more small scale. We sell into the interior of Canada. But yes, they're heading up all over, and we get calls to help. Can you help us start up? Like we did a software development, which, wow, there wasn't software to help run this properly over the last year, but in conjunction, the Port Orford Fresh Catch down in Port Orford, Oregon, helped pay for some of that, and they're involved. So it is a network. I didn't actually address that, but we don't deal in fish that we don't think are, caught properly, sustainably, local. We are ocean-wise recommended. We have only sold ocean-wise in the past. It's not a perfect system by any means. It's a good start to get people thinking about it. We are happy to describe how everything is caught, why we think it's sustainable. I mean, that's sort of the open communication we have with our members, which is part of it. You can hear alarmist things about, gill netting, which for some species is a horrible thing to do, like drift netting, which can catch anything. Gill netting for salmon here, my bycatch is below, it's usually below 1%, maybe 2 on a bad day. It's the way we do it here is quite good. It comes from the same place, exactly. It's just, and we don't, unlike the fish companies that lend money to somebody and want all your fish, we don't insist on all your fish. If you can get a better catch, a lot of our guys sell some of their fish at say, our main shrimper sells at the farmer's market near his home in Qualicum. Those are shrimp, but he can't sell it all. And we've managed to create this network that helps move more of it. And if we can, get someday up to 1% of the BC fishing industry, that would be huge for the small community of people we deal with. And if we can just help out selling half of someone's catch at a better rate. And sometimes when the market drives the prices up, actually, we're not paying much more than anyone else. But people are just happy to not see it disappear into this industrial supply chain now. On a smaller level, and there are smaller ones, and there is the Michelle Rose CSF out of Cowichan. And when people have asked us, hey, can you deliver into Victoria, we've always been kind of hesitant, saying not till he's over capacity. And so they can be done at different sizes. And my wife and I had a lot of debates early on. What do we become? How do we maintain this, our values as we scale? And can we just have a bigger positive aspect as we scale? So I think there's room for small ones, absolutely. But you need to be scaled if you're going to move this fish into bigger markets. And I have, we discussed initially, why are we selling to Calgary? Well, Calgary eats a lot of fish, and where are they getting it from? And the answer was not good places when we researched. And I'm actually looking at, you probably figured out I look historically, and there's lots of evidence of First Nations fish being traded for economic well across the Rockies. And this is traditional stuff that we're trying to do. Well, I would love to see less multinationals owning the fishing industry. I have a problem with any shareholder-based organization that needs to maximize profit ever owning a natural resource. And unfortunately, with the quota system in BC, that is the case. So we're in a bit of a tight spot. If we can affect change right now by raising price, that's wonderful. But I would like to see more and more going into this direct market. And I think we're just getting back to more traditional ways anyway, in which fishermen were more tightly, through a fishmonger, tightly connected to the community of people that ate it. That's, the 20th century was a real aberration. Everything changed, right? Like, I used to think we were at peak beer until I read a stat that said, actually, we just caught up to the number of breweries that existed pre-prohibition. So, I mean, really, we're doing something that's quite old. Well, very much. I mean, but I saw that. Yeah. Like that picture of me in 1978. I mean, I saw the end of an industry. There were people, half the boats were still double-enders. And we would go out in Rivers Inlet. We'd go out on a Sunday night and fish. And then a Monday morning, at first light, the collector boats with the flag looking for company would work through the fleet, and they would come up, tie along shore. And the guys, they wouldn't even put their smokes out. They would just start firing the fish boat to boat into the scale, and then right up, giving you your slip. And I mean, it was quite amazing, but company control, they wouldn't pay you cash for that. not all year. If you needed, it would give you actually like script money, stuff you hear about in, coal mines. You had tickets that said fuel to use at the fuel barge and food to use at the company food store. And that's how you made it through the season. At the end of the year, you would get paid out what they thought you should get paid out, and a box of Purdy's chocolates at Christmas. It was good. That was BC Packers. Everybody got their box of Purdy's chocolates. Maybe Weston owned Purdy's. I don't know, because it was George Weston at the time that owned BC Packers.